excited to be here this morning. So hello from Silicon Valley. It's a little rainy here today, but otherwise the weather's pretty nice. So come on down anytime. We'd love to have you. And so we are in quite the state in manufacturing these days. We certainly have identified a lot of risks and vulnerabilities in manufacturing due to the pandemic. We are experiencing parts shipments and delays, or have in our supply chain around the world. We are experiencing freight rates, incoming freight rates to the US that have doubled. Markets have changed, demand has changed. It's a lot of chaos and turmoil out there in global supply chains. So today I'm going to challenge you to think about what your global manufacturing strategy is, and would you consider the possibility of reshoring at least some of your manufacturing or your sourcing to the US? Okay. Whoops. Okay. So this is a little bit more about me. I've been in global manufacturing and global supply chains for about 30 years. I've worked with over 80 clients worldwide. And at the bottom are my books. As we indicated before, I want to call your attention, though, to the one on the far right. It's called Legal Blacksmith, and I wrote that together with an attorney a couple of years ago. In that particular book, the front part of each chapter is about a topic in supply chain, such as procurement or forecasting or warehousing. And the back part is written by an attorney that has all the legal clauses that you need to put into your contracts in those areas. So it's quite a good desk reference, and I'd never miss an opportunity to publicize my books. So if you're interested, they're all available on Amazon. Okay, a little bit about the Reshoring Institute. It was established about 6 years ago now, and we have a dual mission, and one is to provide research and consulting services for companies that are considering bringing back manufacturing to America. And that's through our leadership team and those of us that have extensive experience in manufacturing. And the second mission is to provide experiential education for university students, mostly graduate students, so that they can learn about global manufacturing. And our student interns are paid, and they work 100 hours per semester, and we direct their research as well as they support some of our consulting work. So it's quite a great opportunity for students to join us for a short period of time and learn about global manufacturing, because the one thing that we know is that our interns in business are typically MBA students, or in engineering are MEs and other kinds of engineers, and they're going to be the leaders in manufacturing in the future. So you can see the universities that we are affiliated with right now. So Rutgers in New Jersey, St. Louis, of course, UC Marshall, that's USC in Southern California, the University of San Diego, where we actually started, Texas Christian, Stony Brook in New York, Purdue, George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And that's an important one because a lot of policies that are developed by the government are very critical to an operating environment in manufacturing. And we have a particularly great intern that's working on manufacturing policy at George Washington. And then University of Kentucky, Santa Clara here in Silicon Valley, and Arkansas. Okay, so in the 1990s and the 2000s, offshoring to China was the thing to do. It was the economic strategy of most US manufacturers. And I'll tell you, I helped during that period of time dozens of manufacturers in the US either find sources in China or move part or all of their manufacturing to China. It was a very interesting time, and everybody was jumping on the bandwagon. This is a picture of the Forbidden City in Beijing, the picture that I took. It's, if you have a chance to get to Beijing, you should visit there. But it was a strategy where I was placing companies and starting up operating companies all across China, in all kinds of cities and places across China. This is a typical manufacturing site, and because you guys are manufacturers, I know you recognize it's a machine shop. This particular shop was a huge place. There were about 6 or 7 bays, just like this one, stacked up side by side. Now, the reason why I show this when I'm doing a presentation is because it shows what manufacturing is actually like in China. This particular machine shop is partially state-owned by the communist government and partly commercially owned. And it was, I had a client in the automotive industry, and one day I went to work at the office in Beijing, and the purchasing manager said, "We're going out to see a supplier. Do you want to come with us?" And I sort of said, "Of course." I love crawling around factories. But this was particularly interesting because he said this particular machine shop made high quality parts, and they really liked this supplier, and they went to visit them to talk about an additional contract. So when we got there, the general manager met us at the door and said that he had a meeting to go to, and he would be back in about 10 minutes. But just go ahead and walk around and have a look around. And so that was sort of my first clue. I don't know of any other place I've ever been in a manufacturing environment where they said just go walk around through the shop. You're always escorted and never allowed to be wandering around. So if you look in the middle here, these are my colleagues, and we walked about halfway down, and they were talking to one of the machinists and that was making their parts. And so I'm looking and wandering through this place, and a couple things that I want to point out. So you see the yellow line, kind of, sort of. Well, in our factories, we have very bright yellow lines, and we're told, stay within the yellow lines. Don't walk around the machinery. But there was no kind of guidance in that regard. We didn't have any eye protection, no goggles, no toe protection, nothing. We were just walking through the shop. Look at this guy here in the front. He's wearing those little black Chinese cloth shoes. No toe protection, no gloves, and he's operating this machine tool. They were cutting metal down on this area. So the reason why I point this out is because this is typical in China, where there are rules and laws and guidance and so forth, but they're rarely followed. And this makes the operating environment very inexpensive. So it's not just a cheap labor rate that we're dealing with, it's overall low cost operations because they don't adhere to all the regulations that we would in the US. And they're often supplemented by government funding. The reshoring movement in America really started in 2012 when during the presidential election between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, and they were both China bashing like crazy. So here I am helping all these companies offshore to China, and I'm like, oh man, I can't tell anybody what I do for a living. This is this is really awful. And they were going on and on about China. So really, it kicked off a lot of discussions that I had with executives I was working with, who came to me and said, could we manufacture in America? Would that be even possible? Is there any way we could make it competitive? And that was the sort of the catalyst for the reshoring movement. So way back in 2012. And after that, we got together and developed a methodology for evaluating manufacturing in America and started the Reshoring Institute as a result. So fast forward to today, why are companies reshoring now? Well, certainly the mood of America has changed. We are very kind of critical of China these days and are interested in seeing what we could do. Would it be possible to bring manufacturing back? The tax reforms and the repatriation of funds under the Tax Act of 2017 was very helpful. As I'm sure many of you know, the tax rate was extremely high on US manufacturers, somewhere around 29 or 30%. And under the Tax Reform Act of 2017, it was reduced to about 21%. The global rate for taxes around for manufacturers around the world is 24%. So we are in very good shape in terms of tax rates, and that really leveled the playing field. Now, the intent of that was to fuel repatriation of jobs and manufacturing to the U.S., and that unfortunately that didn't really happen. Most companies simply took advantage of the lower tax rate, or bought back stock, or paid dividends, or took different financial measures, and there was very little reshoring that happened. Then the tariffs, the 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel, and the 301 tariffs on Chinese imports were intended to drive manufacturing back to the US because the cost for imports was increased. And unfortunately, that had almost no effect either. So what happened with the application of the tariffs, and I helped a lot of companies work on exclusion requests, and we tried all kinds of different strategies, but most companies simply absorbed the additional cost or passed it on to their customers, and it drove almost no reinvestment in reshoring. However, the global pandemic is a whole nother bag of tricks. The pandemic really made manufacturing and executives sit up and take notice of the risk and exposure in their global supply chains. So now, introducing all of the financial stuff that went before with the Tax Reform Act of 2017, the tariffs, and the anti-China sentiment, the global pandemic really put the crowning effect on that. And indeed, now many executives are considering a different kind of strategy, whether it's coming out of China or finding another low-cost country, or rethinking their global strategies. And that's where I'm very interested in pushing today, and making sure that you are all prepared for that kind of decision. Of course, there's always intellectual property protection problems around the world. We have lots of strategies for that. If you're in that situation, we've helped a number of companies with strategies for protecting their IP. Advanced technologies. So the way to make manufacturing more economical in the U.S. is to evaluate the cost structures and to introduce automation where you can. So it's not accurate to think that we're going to bring all the jobs back to the U.S. and we're going to reshore everything. The jobs have changed, the technology has changed, and in order to be cost competitive, we have to automate production to the fullest extent possible. And that allows us to extract cost out of the manufacturing environment. So advanced technologies play a key role and need to be introduced into the cost equations. There are certainly incentives offered by state and local governments. You may be aware of those, where you're getting a tax incentive or some kind of other break because you're bringing manufacturing back or expanding manufacturing in the US. There's some reduced environmental regulations. Now, I'm sort of a tree-hugging Californian, and I believe in protecting the environment. However, I also know that many of the regulations regarding environmental issues in manufacturing were onerous and had gone too far. So I was happy to see some of these regulations pulled back. On the other hand, I think we pulled back too many in some cases. But a balance in that area, I think, is very important for manufacturing health. And finally, what we call economic patriotism, which is companies that just the executives feel that it's important that we support manufacturing in America. It's the right thing to do for our country. So now I would challenge you, what is your manufacturing strategy? Have you thought through it? Do you have any understanding of what might be going on in that regard? Many of our clients are doing a get out of China or a China plus one strategy. So getting out of China is one thing that companies are interested in, but I'll tell you, it's very complicated. You'd be surprised at some of the things that I've seen. It's next to impossible to get your machine tools out of China, molds, tools, dies. Those things are considered part of the infrastructure once you've sent them to China, and you're probably never getting them back, even though your contract may say they belong to you. So, there's a heavy cost there. There are things like employment contracts that require you to pay out a full year's wages to many of the workers if you shut down, sometimes 2 years' wages. There are permits that you have to get to leave China, that are complicated by government strategies and whether or not they want you to leave. So, the complications in leaving China are massive and shouldn't be taken lightly. Lots of our customers want to do a China plus one strategy, which is keeping some manufacturing in China and then adding another low cost country such as Vietnam or Thailand or Mexico or Malaysia. And so that's what we call a China plus one. Sometimes it's a China plus two. Moving sourcing or manufacturing to an alternate low cost country like that is typical of what companies are thinking through these days. And I would encourage you to do that too. And hopefully that means reshoring some of your production. We'd like nothing more than to help you bring some manufacturing back to the US. Other companies are building inventory to mitigate their risk worldwide after they experienced significant shortages during the initial stages of the pandemic. And then passing costs off to customers or doing something else with the costs in order to keep manufacturing competitive in the US. But I would challenge you to consider what you would do about your export markets if you're selling globally. You may be shooting yourself in the foot to leave China if China is your growth market. And across Asia, the growth markets are about 14% on average, which is just huge, huge. So if you're looking for a growth strategy, you must consider having some production in Asia to serve the Asian market. And then what will Biden do? So, Biden has already announced a number of Made in America strategies, and they're published on his website that you might have a look at so that you understand what direction we may go in. It's very likely he's going to increase pressure to have the government buy products made in the USA. And as you may know, there are labeling requirements that have to be met in order to achieve a made in the USA labeling versus an assembled in the USA label. There are other strategies like infrastructure building and things that are going to create a hardy environment, I think, for growth in manufacturing in the US. So it's a good idea to understand what direction the administration is going. Thinking about your total cost of ownership. So this is always the first place that everybody goes when they're trying to make one of these decisions. It's what is our total cost of ownership? And they start looking at labor costs and comparing operating costs in the US and in Asia, mostly in China. But I would admonish you, that's not enough. That is not enough. You really have to, that's sort of the baseline. And, all the consulting companies, everybody has a TCO model. They're a dime a dozen, everybody publishes them. We have one. However, every company is different. And in order to make a truly thoughtful decision, you not only have to consider the costs, but now you have to understand whether you could automate a process to extract labor. What is the proximity to the markets you're serving? Are your customers mostly in the US, for example, or are they mostly in Asia? So proximity to that market, how well can you serve them? What are your turnaround times? Your logistics costs, it used to be we could get a container from Asia from say Shanghai to Los Angeles for $1,000. These days, that cost for the same container is $2,000. So the freight costs have gone up considerably, especially during the pandemic. The value of Made in USA labeling, we did a study, a sort of in-depth study a couple of months ago where we surveyed 500 people across America and asked them a couple simple questions. Number one, do you prefer products made in the USA? And number two, would you pay more for them if you had a product that was made here? And the answers were overwhelmingly yes. I think about 80% of the people said they would prefer products made in the USA and then be willing to pay up to about 20% more. So 10 to 20% more. That survey is available on our website. We have a huge website, by the way. It's reshoringinstitute.org. And there is a link from the landing page directly to that survey if you're interested in getting more information. So with that, we know that customers in the US are willing to pay more for products that are made here. Then that changes your cost structure as well. You can afford a little bit more cost if you can charge more for your products made here. Certainly customer preference for products made in the US, economic incentives that are offered by local and state governments. Those are important to filter into your overall total cost of ownership. And remembering, and this is a lesson for us as well when we're helping clients do these kind of calculations, that every company is different and decisions can't be made just alone on the numbers. There are certainly dangers lurking around every corner if you're trying to reshore. There's uncertainty, a lot of global uncertainty and unrest right now that we haven't seen in a number of years, but there's a lot of turbulence and bad impressions of America around the world, essentially. And so, understanding what those are and why it would be good to leave or not leave is important. Costs are increasing. Redeveloping your supply base, boy, this is a big one. As manufacturing moved to China, so did all the suppliers. Your entire supply chain moved there. So if you decide to reestablish manufacturing in the U.S., you're going to have to redesign and reestablish and redevelop your supply chain in the U.S. as well. Global shortages for people hoarding parts that think there's going to be a shortage, that's creates issues across the board for companies and is a lot of exposure in terms of risk. So a lot of turbulence and uncertainty. So flexibility and responsiveness are really key to being effective. Now I want to tell you a couple of little stories before I end here. This is General Electric. They were making most of their appliances in Appliance Park in Louisville, Kentucky, until GE decided under Jack Welch to move almost all of their manufacturing offshore. So they moved all of the appliance manufacturing into China and other places and pretty much shut down all of their US manufacturing plants. And this was in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And of course, the financial results were wonderful. So Jack Welch was really touted for being a miracle worker in terms of finances. But when Jeff Immelt took over, he challenged the engineers to try to bring some manufacturing back to America. And they started with water heaters. So most of us have those big white round water heaters in our garage or our basement that heat water all day long. So even me, when I go to China, I close the door and lock the door and turn off the lights and set the alarm, and I go off to China for 6 weeks. And boy, my white water heater in the garage is heating water, by God, just in case. Even though nobody's home for 6 weeks, that water heater is heating water. It's kind of ridiculous, So what GE did was they designed a GeoSpring water heater that heats on demand. So it's got a little chip in it, and instead of having a tank that heats water all day long, It heats on demand. It's highly automated, and they re-engineered their manufacturing processes to automate the production line as much as possible. They negotiated with unions to reduce the labor in the U.S. And they reopened GE Appliance Park in Louisville, Kentucky, and put 4,000 people back to work. 4,000 people. And now today they're making water heaters, high-end wine coolers, high-end refrigerators and dishwashers. So they've really have a great success story. And as you may know, the GE Appliance division was actually sold to Haier, which is a Chinese company, but they still retained all of their US manufacturing. This is WaterLogic. We worked with them over about a year. WaterLogic is they make the water purification systems like when you fill up your water bottle at the airport, and it comes out of that little filtering spigot. They make that kind of equipment. WaterLogic was based in the UK, is based in the UK, and they have a very strong presence across Europe. They were manufacturing in Qingdao, China. They have a big modern factory in Qingdao, but their growth market was the US. So they were really growing a lot here. And so they wanted to establish manufacturing in the US. So their global strategy was to understand and move some of that manufacturing back to the US, and we helped them do that. Ultimately, they chose a location near the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, and they put 200 people, they designed a new factory and put 200 people to work. So it's really pretty spectacular. What a great company it is to work with. And finally, this is one of my favorites. This is IRT Wheels. So the guy that owns this place, Ray Asante, is a veteran, and he was on the racing cycle. So he was one of the elite racers after he got out of the service, and raced on the world circuit. He's an engineer by training, and so he was always tweaking his bicycle and so forth. Well, Ray got cancer, and he had to leave the circuit as a result of that. But an engineer by training, he opened his own little shop, and he started developing hubs for racing cycles. So the middle section of the wheel. And what he would do is design a hub based on the specs that the racer wanted. And then he'd send off a prototype or the blueprints to Taiwan, and Taiwan would make a prototype and they'd send it back, and then he'd tweak it and send it back for production. And all this took like 6 weeks. So Ray got fed up one day, and he went out and bought a 3D printer and started printing that particular part. So ultimately, he was able to save about $100,000 in operational costs, and was able to serve his customers, which are these elite cyclists, in about 48 hours. So if they decide they want a new hub or design something new, they come to him and he can turn it around in 48 hours. It's a huge success story. And finally, this is my contact information. As I mentioned, we have a huge website. It's called reshoringinstitute.org. And all of our research is available, and you can download it. We don't make you sign up for anything. You can just download stuff. We have white papers, case studies, our survey, our US manufacturing survey. We have information on labeling products, on government policies, all kinds of stuff there. So lots of goodies for you to choose from. And thank you very much for your time today.